All right, what's up, my brothers? So in this video, we're going to be talking about the 7 spokes of a high-value man, more specifically the spoke known as unplugging. If you're newer to my channel, I've written 2 best-selling books now. One's called The Unplugged Alpha, and the second edition, I deal with the 7 spokes of a high-value man. The reason why these are important, and we're going to cover this in this video, is the vast majority of men today who are struggling in life to get what they want out of success, relationships, with women, with friends, and a tribe, and that sort of stuff. They haven't leveled up on these 7 spokes. They mostly live on the bottom shelf. In my second volume, The Top Shelf Man, I talk about how these top 5% of men are getting everything they want out of life, and exactly how you and I can all do the exact same thing and replicate these same successes. It's essentially a copy and paste formula. The first spoke that I want to talk about here again is unplugging. So the 7 spokes, if you're unfamiliar, are looks, money, status, game, frame, captivation, and of course unplugging. We're going to be dealing with unplugging in this video. I'll be making 6 more videos on the other specific topics, on the other spokes, so that you can kind of get your head around it. This video is going to be around the details around women, which is what most of you guys are asking me for a lot these days. But this will help you get more out of what you want out of life as a whole, collectively, if that makes sense. If you've watched the movie The Matrix, you've probably heard of the red pill and the blue pill. This notion of the red pill, which has been kind of like hijacked by the pickup artist community, basically known as red pill awareness. I'm talking about something similar, but I more broadly apply the notion of unplugging to a man's entire life. If you want to get to the top shelf, you have to understand how all these things affect you and the significance and importance of going through the unplugging process in all of these areas. So in this video, I want to share a few very specific and intimate examples, some stories from my own life that forced me to unplug from comforting lies that were sold to me. And this has nothing to do with women. This has everything to do with the reality of the world that we've been placed in, that we live in. So the first story that I want to share with you is when I was a collection industry insider. If you don't know about those details in my former life, I ran one of Canada's most successful debt negotiation companies for several years. It was awarded for company culture, for hypergrowth, a whole bunch of areas. We did very, very well. And I was able to create that business out of nothing, out of a marketplace that didn't really exist in Canada, from my experience and know-how working in the collection industry. More specifically, third-party collections here in Canada. And that business still runs today. My brother looks after it. TotalDebtFreedom.ca is a website if you want to go creep it and check it out and learn more about it. But early on in those days, I didn't know a whole lot about, the recovery process of credit card debt. They didn't really tell us very many details about how credit card companies collect money, why they collect money that way, how they do it that way, and so on and so forth. So this first unplugging event, which was very uncomfortable and very, very bizarre for me to understand, because the notion of non-profit to me, and I've heard this a number of times, there's non-profit organizations that will do things like take blood donations from people. There's non-profit organizations that will help people resolve debt, credit card debt, specifically, or unsecured debt. And throughout most of North America, there's an industry known as nonprofit credit counseling. I'm going to talk a little bit about the blood donation stuff in a little bit as well too, but nonprofit credit counseling has been around for a long time, and it's very, very successful. They get a lot of funding and tax credits, and they've got a very tight association and relationship with the credit card companies. And what I discovered as I had sort of moved from the collection world to running my own debt negotiation business is that all of these companies throughout North America, they aren't really working for the consumer. They're actually working for the credit card companies as a kinder, more friendlier collection agency, essentially working for the credit card issuers and delivering them an alternative way to collect their debt while preserving their profit margins and also controlling the process for the vast majority of the situations that are involved for many, many people. So they offer out this program to the public and they say, look, you can pay your debt over 60 months and we'll either freeze or we'll slightly reduce the interest, or maybe we'll eliminate the interest. In the vast majority of cases, if your interest rate's like 20% on a credit card, they'll reduce it down maybe 15, 10%. In some cases, creditors will freeze the interest and make it 0, but it doesn't happen very often. And I was curious about this when I got into my debt negotiation business, because what I did was I essentially brokered a deal between the creditor and the debtor. We would argue financial hardship, and the point being essentially was to improve their credit, give them a lot more control over eliminating their credit card debt, and at the same time making sure that they're able to get into new credit facilities in the future without too much difficulty. And I saw a lot of pushback from the nonprofit credit counseling world, which I thought was bizarre, because if your label is nonprofit and you're not supposed to be making a profit, how do they get paid? Like, how do they end up paying their CEOs and their employees and their staff and all this thing? And I remember I had a call one time when I just started out my debt settlement business from the CEO of one of Toronto's very large nonprofit credit counseling agencies, and he wanted to meet for coffee because he was interested in my business and, you know, quote unquote, picking my brain. What he really wanted to do was he wanted to sort of investigate my industry. And I remember he showed up in a very expensive meeting to this coffee date sort of thing, if you can call it that, in a Bentley. And it's like, you know, you think to yourself, why does somebody who is running, or, you know, the CEO of a company that is nonprofit credit counseling, which is supposed to help people with financial hardship, driving a Bentley? That's a nice car. I'm not even driving a Bentley. I'm driving a German SUV, a mid-size 5-seater German SUV. And I'm like, wow, this guy is, you know, something's up here. I have questions. Anyway, you know, I sat down with this guy. I answered a few of his questions. You know, we shook hands and we left as, you know, friends, I would suppose, you know, you could say. But seeing him come and go in this Bentley made me ask a lot of questions. And one of the first things that you got to do when it comes to unplugging as a man is ask the question, why? Get comfortable with asking why in life. If I can give you one thing in this video, is ask why. So I'm asking myself in my head, you know, this is well over 25 years ago. Why is this guy showing up to a meeting in a Bentley? And I think I had a 4Runner at the time, and I'm showing up in a Toyota. That's interesting. I'm an entrepreneur, I'm self-employed. He claims he's an entrepreneur, he's running a nonprofit agency. How is it that he's making so much money that he can drive a Bentley? So I started to peel back the layers of an onion, and as you do when you kind of open up an onion, you start to cry when you discover the reality of how things actually work. Again, the public-facing narrative is we're a kind agency that will reduce your interest rate and get you out of debt over 60 months. But what they're really doing is they're essentially a arm's length deal of the credit issuers, of the banks and credit card companies. Essentially, they just give you a little bit of a savings on your interest rate, but you pay back the full principal with some interest over 60 months. As you're doing that, your credit's in the toilet for 60 months, for a very long period of time. And then I compared it to my model, and it's like my model was negotiate between the creditor and debtor, and I had copies of the credit bureau before and after, and I saw that the credit bureau improved an average of about 150 points during a 3-year relationship with us. Let's call it 36 months versus 60 months. Almost half the time. And their credit rating was better. They saved more money because they paid on average about 35 to 40 cents on the dollar, whereas with nonprofit credit counseling, they're paying 100% back on the dollar, plus a little bit of a reduction in the interest rate. And I'm thinking to myself, how are these guys getting paid? And I started to look at the numbers, and I saw what their revenue source was. And while the consumer pays them what was called a fair share at the time, I'm not sure what they call it today, the vast majority of their compensation actually came from the banks and credit card companies. So you as a consumer with debt, who were paying them to get you out of credit card debt, were actually paying them to be a nice collection agency with a big smile on their face, getting the credit card companies back most of their money, while trashing your credit rating and paying back significantly more than what our program would do. And I found that very interesting. That was a significant unplugging moment for me, because I had realized that that entire process was a lie. Another thing that I also came across in the Bankruptcy Insolvencies Act, as I started to read the details of that, I'm like, okay, well, how are bankruptcy trustees getting paid? I know in the States you have a slightly different name for it. You have insolvency lawyers, or whatever the process is called. Here in Canada, there's a federal act called the Bankruptcy Insolvencies Act, and essentially governs how bankruptcy trustees eliminate people's credit card debt when they're insolvent. So you have to be insolvent, basically meaning you owe more than what you own. So your assets might be $50,000, but you owe $150,000. You're a candidate for one of their programs. Now, what I noticed, this was another unplugging moment for me as well, is bankruptcy trustees, they could get you out of debt in a little over a year for a first-time bankrupt. You could be discharged, your credit rating's wiped clean, and within a couple of years, you're in a pretty good position. Like, you're on the right path to getting to where you want to go. You've eliminated your debt. It didn't cost you a tremendous amount of money like nonprofit credit counseling. But the bankruptcy trustees were always pushing an alternative program called consumer proposals. And I'm like, this is interesting. Again, I started meeting with some of these bankruptcy trustees. They started asking about my business. I sat down with several of them. You take a look at their office space and you walk in, then you're like, wow, these are some nice marble floors, giant tiles, 24 by 24. Those are expensive. I know, I just built a custom home. That's interesting. And then you sit down with them and you take a look at their office space. And I know what I was paying for office space at the time, and I was paying for way cheaper looking office space than they were on the front end. And I'm like, you start adding these things up. You know, you're asking yourself the question, why? Why are they able to operate? Why are they able to afford this expensive office space? Why the expensive marble tiles? How do they get paid? That's a nice tailored suit that he's wearing. And you kind of ask yourself, why? What nice watch on their wrist, right? Very expensive Rolexes and stuff like that. And I'm like, huh. And they keep pushing the consumer proposal. And I'm like, okay. Then I start going to the money, right? Because when you have questions about stuff like this, and you ask the questions why, then you start sort of, again, you peel back the layers of the onion, you start to cry when you see the reality, and it's like, okay, so how do these guys get paid? And it's like, this is really interesting, because now the bankruptcy trustee who advertises to essentially settle your debt, they're basically ripping off our model and saying that we're settling the consumer's debt. But I was looking at how do they get paid, and yes, they take a payment from the consumer. So the person in debt that hires them is paying a monthly fee to them, again, usually over 60 months, trashes the credit rating, costs them a tremendous amount of money, but it's a reduction versus nonprofit credit counseling. So that's what the difference is. They kind of settle it a little bit. But the difference is that the trustee gets paid on how much money they get back to the creditor. So I was incentivizing my staff at the time and paying them a bonus based on how much they could reduce the consumer's debt for. So if they owed $1, they would get a larger bonus for reducing the consumer's debt from $1 down to, let's say, 30 cents versus 60 cents. So if they could only get a reduction down to 60 cents, they wouldn't get quite the same bonus. So we get paid more by saving the consumer a lot more money. And then I looked at how the bankruptcy trustees were getting paid, and guess what? They got paid more for getting more money back to the banks and credit card companies. In fact, the entire program was not incentivized to really save the consumer a ton of money the way that we were structured, but it was incentivized to get money back to the banks. So then I started to see, all right, nonprofit credit counseling, basically run by the banks, Bankruptcy Trustees Insolvencies Act, basically everything in the act is designed to get the guy out of debt, but also minimize the loss to the bank and maximize the profits where possible, as they can write off in areas that they're able to write off in their books and federal laws and stuff like that. But our system was independent. We were private. And when we would negotiate between the creditor and the debtor, we would only get paid by the consumer that we hired, the guy with the credit card debt, right? We never took any money from the banks or the credit card companies, which then led to the next unplugging moment for me, which was when we started to see this new bill introduced in Parliament, and this was throughout Canada in the different provinces, which was essentially designed to put debt negotiation companies out of business. The bill was pushed through by the lobbying efforts of the big banks. Okay, these banks have more money than God. They have very, very deep pockets. They can afford to hire whoever they want to lobby on whatever basis or topic that they want. All right, well, that was interesting. So I became the chairman of the lobbying group that was up against all the big banks, basically David versus Goliath. And then I started going to Queen's Park, which is where all the provincial politicians are, and I sat and I talked with the conservative politicians and the liberal politicians and the NDP, which is the Socialist Party here, and I dealt with all these politicians, and guess what? They're all exactly the same. They're all identical. And I remember, you know, talking to the guy that I had hired as a lobbyist. So if you're unfamiliar with what lobbyists are, you pay them a lot of money. It cost me like 60 grand to lobby against this bill. And I was sitting down talking to this guy, you know, one time after having several of these meetings. I'm like, it just doesn't seem like these politicians are listening. Like, what's happening here? He goes, yeah, I'm starting to see that too, right? And he's like, it almost seems like they should be calling this new bill, which was called Bill 55, the Protect Credit Card Companies and Banks Profit Margin at All Costs Act, which is essentially what the language in it was designed to do. It was designed to get rid of an industry that I operated in, that saved people a lot of money, that protected their credit ratings, that got them out of credit card debt quickly at a minimal cost, while having an advocate in their corner, which didn't exist before. And here we are with now the government, who's supposed to care about people, putting or passing legislation through that would delay the first Revenue Act by 8 months and reduce it by about 33%, so 1/3. Those two conditions would have put out of business the entire industry. Now, we got lucky because I'm smart. We found a carve out in the language in this legislation, and that business, Total Debt Freedom, still runs today under that. But it was a very difficult environment for a lot of people at that time, and the vast majority of these debt negotiation companies, they just went out of business. And you know, they did it under the guise of protecting the consumer, and you know, we're here to do what's right, and these companies are nefarious and they're taking advantage of vulnerable people and all that sort of stuff, when the exact opposite was true. It was essentially the big credit card issuers that were taking advantage of people in a vulnerable position that had credit card debt by getting back the maximum amount of money to the bank while destroying the credit rating, which is something that we weren't doing, right? We were getting back the minimum amount, getting paid by the consumer, and the staff were being paid a bonus based on how much they could save the consumer. Well, guess what? The big credit card companies didn't like that, did they? Right? So these are some examples that I've seen in my own personal life that apply broadly beyond just, you know, dealing with the sexual marketplace and relationships and divorce and all that kind of stuff. And as you keep going down the rabbit hole and you start, you know, looking at, well, how does family law work? That was another interesting unplugging moment for me as well too, because, you know, when I got divorced, the very first conversation that I had with my lawyer was essentially, all right, well, how do we plan this untying of the knot? What are the next steps? And I was like, you know, we should take this to court and get this thing wrapped up. And I was just like, you know, I just thought, sure, you know, you get married, it doesn't work out, there's, you know, there's divorce and family law, you just untie the knot and you move on, sort of thing. And he's like, no, you don't want to go to court, my friend. He goes, if you have the penis, you're going to lose, right? And he started telling me these stories about some of his prior clients and his 20 years of experience in family law, and how a lot of guys got ran through the grinder and destroyed. And then I started reading forums about men's experience in this, and it was completely different from what I was led to believe by their comforting lies, right? You know, I've said this before. They want to sell us comforting lies. They don't want to tell us the cold hard truth about the reality of the world because they want to control us, right? And we saw this again with the COVID scamdemic. Stand on your dots, wear your face diapers, take this injection if you want to travel, if you want to protect your loved ones, which we say is safe and effective, that proved to be neither safe nor effective and harmful to people. And the vast majority of the population, they just kind of went with it. You know, they just sort of like fell for it and accepted the notion of doing exactly what they were told to do for something that was essentially as dangerous as the common cold at the end of the day. It was a big steaming pile of horse shit. So I'm going to leave it on that note. What I wanted to do, the aim of this video really was to sort of explain to you guys how you need to look at the world in the reality that you live in and unplug from all of the lies that they've sold to us, because it goes well beyond just, you know, sound bites that I've used many times, like you know, women wait at the finish line and they pick the winners, they don't care about your struggles, that sort of stuff. That's all become commonplace now. Like, everybody's ripped that off and they've used that on their material, and they, you know, they just kind of go about it like that. But what I'm trying to explain to you guys here with this is that for you to get what you want out of life, for you to truly level up, you need to understand the game so that you can play it better. When you understand the game, you don't waste your time in areas of your life spinning your wheels, running on their treadmill to sort of accommodate them and their narratives. We live in an us versus them world, right? Like, that's one of the things that you've got to understand, is that nobody cares about you. Nobody cares about straight white men more specifically, but nobody really cares about us the way that we've been told to. The government doesn't care about us. They're not looking out for our best interests. I literally sat down during these lobbying efforts in front of socialist politicians, and they were going on during the lunch ordering on my credit card bill, by the way, very expensive steaks and all kinds of things, talking about their cars and their boats. And then, you know, you see how they behave publicly. I'm going to wrap it up on this note so I don't drone on too long, but there was a politician here who ran the Federal Socialist Party. His name was Jagmeet Singh, and he was the critic actually on the bill that I dealt with at the time. He's an absolute piece of trash garbage. You know, he's a former lawyer, and he had the opportunity to put Trudeau out of office at a time when we had a good conservative leadership to call a new election, but he didn't want to do it because it would have erased his pension. So he basically screwed over the entire country, and you can't debate me on this. Anybody with a brain in their head saw it for what it was. He basically screwed over the entire country so he could get his big fat pension. 42 million Canadians got screwed over because this one guy, Jagmeet Singh, wanted to get his pension. Guys, I'm telling you, you have to open your eyes and take a look at the world around you and see exactly how it works and see it for what it is, and then adjust accordingly. All that I do when I'm putting out this content and I'm having these conversations is I create a map and I plot the landmines on the map and I say walk around these things. I'm literally looking in my mirror and there's a guy sitting in his car right now by himself with masks hanging from his rearview mirror, you know, his like scamdemic masks. This is the world that we live in, right? Like there's a lot of plugged in men out there today that are just following the narrative. Guys, if you're serious about taking things to the next level, to level up and really get exactly what you want out of life and getting more out of these 7 spokes, I created something just for you. It's called the School of Unplugging. It's pinned below in the top comment, and all you really have to do is participate in the discussion board, follow all of the classroom material, and copy and paste and do exactly what I tell you to do following these step-by-step action items, and you will, without a doubt, get far better results out of life. Time and time again, 100% of you, as long as you follow the steps. Go check out my school. I made it for you. It's for you guys. Sign up today. It's less than $50 a month. The price will be going up once we hit 150 members. See you guys later. Peace out.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up.